Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
To what extent is my status in life, or any of our status in life, predictable from the kind of house we grew up in? And what is the mechanism that is linking us to these previous generations and to the circumstances of our birth? So it's a question just of the strength of inheritance, and then secondly, the mechanism of inheritance. And the simple way that economists have chosen to measure social mobility is just what's the correlation between your status and the status of your parents. Okay? If that correlation is 1, then at birth, all of your outcomes are perfectly predictable. If it's 0, every generation is born anew, nothing is predictable. And the standard results on intergenerational correlation, there have been many, many measurements of this for income, for years of education, for occupational status, is that that correlation is actually quite low, varying between 0.2 and 0.6. And that implies that if only your parents matter to your outcome, within 3 or 4 generations in most societies, all earlier status will have been lost, and there are no lineages that matter once we get to grandparents or great-grandparents. That societies are really born anew every 3 or 4 generations. The other thing that that research seems to establish is that social mobility rates vary substantially across societies. And here's a recent example of this, which is looking at the intergenerational correlation of earnings. And then at the bottom, it's showing what is the degree of inequality of income within societies. And what you find is that there are a bunch of Nordic societies, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, which have both highly equal conditions and also apparently a very small intergenerational correlation. And the implication of this data, by the way, is that in somewhere like Sweden, only 4% of the current generation's income variation is explicable from their parents. 96% is some kind of random component, their own individual personality, accidents. Only 4% is explicable by parents. You find out the UK and the US have intermediate levels of inequality, intermediate levels of correlation, and then South America is associated with high inequality, high degree of correlation. And what this figure implies is that some societies must be having dramatic failures in social mobility. That in some societies there must be many people of potential talent who are trapped in unrewarding jobs or jobs that don't fulfill their full potential. And there must be a lot of people who don't have talent who are finding themselves still at the top positions within these societies. And so that variation implies that there is a very significant social mobility problem and that it's something that policymakers really need to pay attention to. And what else do we get from this? That variation also suggests that it's culture, human capital, and connections that are the main transmitters of status within societies. If the correlation is only 0.2 in somewhere like Scandinavia, it implies that the role of basic genetics in transmitting status has to be very low, right? Because that force will operate everywhere, and that consequently, most of people's outcomes in lives are determined by social conditions, culture, social elements. It's not a lot to do with the basic biology of inheritance, okay? What we do is actually track social status by using surname lineages. And so the surname is this interesting thing that people carry, which is the one thing that links them to a distant past. And an example of this in England is that there was a medieval surname, Arballistarius, which meant crossbowman, and which I think is found even in the Domesday Book, and was not held by that many people, And then subsequently, the holders of that name moved down socially so that they no longer understood Latin. And so the name became both Arblaster and Alabaster. And there's about 200 people holding each of those names now. But we can say of those people, 20 generations ago, you were descended from someone who was a crosswoman on the patriline. And so that's true, as I say, of large numbers of names in somewhere like England and in many societies, where we can actually track back through many, many generations this one line of descent. And we're only looking at the patriline because of the nature of inheritance. But there's good reason to believe that that is similar to all the other lines of descent. The mating is so assortative that mothers and fathers tend to match up very closely in social status. So it doesn't matter if you only look at the patriline. You'll see the same pattern as if we could look at the matriline and all the intermediate lines as well. So with the surname method, what would we expect? What we would expect is that even though in medieval England, surnames differed very significantly in social status. And I can give you an example. Anyone named after a place had a high status name in the Middle Ages. If you're named a patronym such as Williams, that's a low status name in the Middle Ages. And so these names came with status in the beginning. The Norman surnames were very high status in early England. But within 3 or 4 generations, if the standard studies of social mobility are correct, all surnames should become equivalent. And surnames should not reveal anything about social status except for rare surnames, which by random chance can move up or down the status hierarchy. Okay? But in general, surnames could quickly lose all information. And the rate at which they lose that information about status can be translated into what's the intergenerational correlation of status. And we have all kinds of measures of status, and one simple one is just, did you attend Oxford or Cambridge in England, where we have records going back to 1200, right? And it defines the top, in the educational terms, somewhere between the top 0.5% and 2% of English society across this period. And we can actually use that as a very nice marker of what the average status of different names is. And then we also have, are you probated, were you a member of parliament? So the nice thing here is that we get very economical use of information. We just need to know what's the general distribution in the population of surnames, and what's that distribution amongst elites or underclass groups, such as criminals, at any time in the society. And when we do that, we get a very consistent and very surprising piece of information. And that is that looking at surnames, the intergenerational correlation of status is somewhere between 0.7 and 0.8. It's very high. Surnames retain status information for, in some cases, as many as 20 generations, if they start out high enough in the status distribution. And the locational surnames from 1300 in England did not become completely average till about 1700, which represents 400 years later. And as I say, at 30 years per generation, that's a lot of time, right? High status surnames from 1800 in England are still high status now. So if we know about you, for example, that you have a rare name and that someone with that name attended Oxford or Cambridge around about 1800, we can predict now that you have a 4 times greater than average chance of attending Oxford and Cambridge. And that's the only thing we know about you, is that you share a surname with someone 200 years ago who happened to attend Oxford and Cambridge. And as I say, that's an incredible retention of information in surnames. That rate of social mobility revealed by surnames varies little across societies and epochs. Social mobility rates in Britain now are about the same as in the Middle Ages. They have not changed, they have not improved. In Sweden, social mobility rates now are no higher than those in England, right? Despite this other data, the underlying rate of social mobility revealed by surnames is the same in Sweden as it is in England. It's the same in Sweden now as it was in pre-industrial Sweden, right? In the United States, social mobility rates are again very similar. In Chile, in South America, social mobility rates are not any lower than they are in Sweden, right? And most surprisingly, in communist China, after the revolution of 1949, which was accompanied by the execution of a large part of the previous ruling class and the flight of many other members of that class to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, to the United States, social mobility rates have improved very, very slightly over these other conditions, right? And it's still the case that names that were high status in the Qing dynasty in China are overrepresented amongst the communist elite now in modern China, and you did not succeed in extirpating the pre-industrial elite class in China, even with the communist revolution. And also surprisingly, Taiwan, where the elite fled, has rates of social mobility since 1949 that are as high as those in China, even though the elite then took over the running of Taiwan. And so, as I say, it's surprisingly constant. It's the same for all measures of status. Wealth, earnings, education, and occupation all seem to move are correlated at this very high rate. It's the same across the status distribution. It's the same for people at the top end, at the bottom end, how strong that correlation is. The majority of social status measured in this way is then consequently, the majority of the variation is actually predictable at birth. If we know essentially your underlying social status from these measures, more than half of what's going to happen to you in terms of where you'll lie in that broad status distribution, we can predict at the point of your birth. It appears impossible to change this correlation substantially because of these different social experiments that we see: Sweden, communist China, Taiwan. And it must be something very strong that's being transmitted within families. If you were to posit that this is actually principally genetic transmission, there's no fact about the social world we could point to that would rule that out, right? We in fact know that it's likely a majority of this is genetic transmission, and that's based on studies of twins and adopted children and how much they inherit their status from biological parents as opposed to adoptive parents. But there's also evidence in this data that suggests that it may even be more important, the biological component, right? That it fits that pattern of biological inheritance. One implication of that would be that wherever we see in the world people who are elites or underclasses, if it's really true that the biology is very important, what it's going to imply is that they're likely drawn from a larger population, but they've been selected by some process that's pulled out an elite or pulled out an underclass. In Muslim societies, the process of conversion to Islam will often result in converts being low status, and in those who remain with the previous indigenous religion being high status. And throughout the Muslim world, then, the remaining Christians from the pre-Muslim era tend to remain as very high status groups, right? And so we can actually show in many cases of elite groups that there is this process of kind of self-selection into an elite. And one of the effects this has in modern America is that the US immigration policy is busy creating new elite groups within the United States, super elite groups, and also new underclasses within the United States. And the evidence here will be that those groups will actually remain for many centuries to come. And these elite groups include Muslims, Coptic Christians, Jewish population. Black Africans are a strong elite group within the United States. The underclass group is the Latino immigration from countries that are very close to the United States, where illegal immigration is very important. And as I say, the nice thing about the book here says that there is no culture of success. You can have any culture you want that's successful. What this seems to be is a result of processes that are pulling out upper class or lower class groups, and then the very strong persistence within these groups of social status over time that then leads to these different groups. And this just illustrates, these are the conventional estimates of income correlation across a variety of countries, and these are the estimates of the underlying correlation of status that comes from the surnames. And as I say, the one exception here, that's actually the one very high estimate, is India. It has a uniquely low rate of social mobility, this measured for West Bengal. And one of the interesting characteristics of India is that marriage is still highly endogamous. It tends to be very strongly within religions and within castes within religions. And one of the predictions, again, of a biological explanation of social mobility would be that endogamy will drive up the persistence of status. That what actually causes social mobility is the mixing of people through marriage, and that the less that occurs, the more marriage occurs within specified religious or ethnic groups, the less social mobility you'll get. And India actually is a nice illustration, again, of the possibility, as I say, that biology is playing a surprising role. And why are these estimates, the Surname estimates and the other estimates, so different? What's happening is that the conventional estimates focus on individual aspects of status. So they say, how does my education compare with my father's? How does my earning compare with my father's? And a problem with that is that we're then going from that to say, well, that's the general rate of social mobility. But it turns out that people's social status is actually a complex of things. It's a mixture of income, wealth, years of education, quality of education, occupation, residence, health, longevity. There's a lot of different things that go into determining someone's overall social status. And individual aspects of social status can actually fluctuate a lot in families that are not changing much in overall social status. And these are choices that people are making all the time, and often they're making choices to trade off income and education, or wealth and occupation. And if we took a much more general measure of status, then you'll see much more persistence. And also you'll see that if income goes down in one generation, it's likely to bounce back up in the next generation. That it's what you have is underlying these things is a general social competence of families, and that competence really changes slowly across generations. And in some sense, to conclude, what happens is that for each individual, there's a status phenotype, which is your measured or apparent status. And underlying this is some kind of true status genotype, which is the status that's going to be transmitted to the next generation. And the argument is that we don't even know what our status genotype is, right? But by a study of our lineage, we can actually learn quite closely what that is, right? And that's why it will seem that we're getting information on what's going to happen to our children by looking at great-grandfathers or great-granduncles, and that all of these people are contributing information, because the idea is that that's actually revealing what your underlying kind of social competence is, and that's the thing that tends to get passed on. And because the normal studies look at that phenotype, you see a lot of this phenotypic variation in status, but what's driving social mobility in the long run is this mysterious social competence that's either culturally or even genetically being passed on from one generation to the next. And then the last thing I'll say is that this is the relative status of different groups now measured in the United States for elite groups. And this is how many doctors there are per 1,000 people relative to the US population as a whole. So Coptic Christians, Hindus, Indian Christians, Iranian Muslims, Maronites, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Koreans, Chinese, Filipinos, Black Africans, Greeks, all of these have become elite groups in recent years in the United States because of the obligation of US immigration policy, and dramatically elite, right, in terms of this data. And it actually suggests that the US will be a society with unusual problems in terms of different groups having very different status and persisting for a long time. But what I wanted to say in conclusion is there are some things we can do to improve social mobility rates. The fact that social mobility is very low, I do not regard as somehow tragic. As long as people still achieve through merit, through hard work, through taking risks, then it's not a tragedy, that it's predictable who is likely to have the qualities that will lead to success, right? It's also predictable who's likely to play in the Premier League based on their ancestry, and we don't regard it as tragic. That for most people in the country, we can say it's not going to happen for you, right? But understanding how much of this is predictable at the time of birth should lead us to consider carefully how much inequality we want to permit in societies, right? The more we understand how much is in your lineage, how much is pre-programmed in terms of people's possibilities, the more humble we are in terms of thinking about, well, how much do we want a winner-take-all society where some people get all the benefits and some people get all the costs?
You've got quite a sort of egalitarian ethos in terms of your prescriptions. But once we accept the sort of fatalism and futility of targeting and concentrating on social mobility, then don't we end up in a situation where we have very great difficulty in motivating ourselves to intervene in an egalitarian way?
I'm an admirer of Nordic societies, and those are quite interventionist societies, but I think the interventions that succeed are those that make the consequences of being at the bottom of the status distribution a lot better than they are in other societies, right? I think the hope that you can change dramatically what people's relative position is going to be in any society is something that we have to give up on, right? If the Swedes can't do that, America's never going to get there, right? And so I think that there's plenty of room for activism left, but the argument would be focus more on inequality than on the idea that somehow we can have high levels of inequality but have everyone, have a chance at winning the prizes.